Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. When we talk about personal finance, most of the account types we end up talking about are investment accounts and brokerage accounts, 401ks, IRAs, 403bs, accounts like that. On the flip side, we also talk about emergency funds because, well, in life, emergencies happen and it helps to have cash to fall back on to handle those emergencies. But outside of these account types, the other account types don't really get talked about that much. But if you think about it, these accounts, these investment accounts, retirement accounts, and emergency funds are not really the accounts that we should be turning to all frequently. At least we should avoid it when we can, because your emergency fund is there for true emergencies. Like if you lose your job and you need to pay your rent or your mortgage so you don't get evicted and have time to look for a new job. And your 401k, your IRA, those are important too, and likely you're making regular contributions. But unless you're actually retired, you're probably not taking money out of these accounts. They're more on a set it and forget it basis. You make your contributions, occasionally check the balances, but you're not really touching that money, or hopefully you're not, unless you're actually retired, but then that's an entirely different situation. There's another account type that we don't really talk about all that often, and that is the sinking fund. A sinking fund is similar to a savings account, but with a purpose all its own. We all probably have a savings account, a little money set aside just in case. And if there's anything life will teach you is you do not need a reason to save. It's generally just a good idea to set a little money aside here and there because having a little cushion will end up helping you out more often than you could ever realize. But with that thought in mind, most of us don't assign a purpose to our savings account. Rather, it's just there in case we want it or in case we need it. Maybe you have a decent amount sitting in your savings. Maybe you keep your savings fairly low. Some people use savings just as a backup for their checking account to ensure that they're never charged an overdraft fee. And in case you aren't aware of this practice, a lot of banks and credit unions will allow you to link your savings account to your checking account. That way, if you ever write a check that you can't cash because your funds in your checking account are too low, the bank will dip into your savings account and allow that check to clear. And this prevents you from ever being charged any overdraft fees, any fines, any penalties. So it is a really good practice, but still you do want to be cognizant of your account balances. Most people tend to have their savings account there just in case. But when it comes to a sinking fund, that is an account with a purpose attached to it. Do you have an upcoming beach vacation? Put the money for this vacation into a sinking fund. Maybe you have a big anniversary coming up, or maybe Christmas is coming up. Take the money for these events and put it into a sinking fund. That way, when that day arrives, that money is there and it's waiting for you. About 74% of Americans have gone into debt to pay for a vacation, according to a new study from the financial planning company LearnVest. 55% of Americans forget to even consider their vacations when laying out their budget for the year. And 36% of Americans took on debt in order to pay for holiday gifts this past December. Without preparing for these events ahead of time, many people end up resorting to debt to take care of them, and that's a bad cycle to get started. When you know you have expenses coming up for these one-time irregular events that, let's face it, happen more frequently than we'd all like to admit, having a well-stocked sinking fund or several sinking funds can help you to take these expenses in stride. Irregular expenses can really throw a wrench in your financial plans. And like I just said, those irregular expenses tend to pop up more than we care to admit because we really aren't stoic creatures that follow the exact same expenses every single month. Quite frankly, this is the most difficult part of budgeting. You have those expenses that are the same from month to month, like your rent or your mortgage. Your groceries are probably pretty similar. Utilities are probably similar. IRA contributions are probably the same from month to month. But it's those irregular things that pop up, those one-time events or those occasional occurrences that are really hard to plan around. Some examples of things you might set money aside for in your sinking fund are car maintenance, like knowing you have to replace your tires soon, medical co-pays, property taxes, vacations, home renovations, concert tickets, just to name a few. Really anything can go into a sinking fund. It's there for those occasional occurrences that tend to show up on a fairly regular basis in our life. If you're anything like me and you enjoy watching videos on how people spend their money, there's plenty of what I spend in a week videos here on YouTube, or reading how people are spending their money. Refinery29 has a column called Money Diaries, which I find absolutely fascinating. You will constantly hear every person who does one of these say, that doesn't happen all the time. Going to that concert, that was a one-time thing. Buying a couch, that was a one-time thing. And yes, likely these are one-time events, but you probably will go to other concerts down the road. You will probably likely buy other home furnishings or other gifts. So these things will pop up again. Maybe not every week, maybe not every month, but they will happen fairly regularly, but on an irregular basis. Hence the need for sinking funds. Now, there is a very big distinction between a sinking fund and an emergency fund. Your emergency fund is there for true emergencies, like you or your spouse lost your job. Now the household has no income. You have no way to make ends meet without this emergency fund. That's when you rely on it. Or perhaps there's a family emergency that forces you to step away from your job. Again, there's no income. You turn to your emergency fund. It is not just to dip into willy-nilly. There is no concert, no couch, no gift, no dinner. That is an emergency. You do not touch your emergency fund for those reasons. You have no control over when it's going to happen. An emergency fund is your safety net to cover those types of emergency expenses. Most emergencies are unforeseen. Sinking events prepare you for expenses that you know are coming up, like an upcoming tax bill or a weekend getaway, events and items that have a definitive time horizon. You don't want to go diving into your emergency fund whenever your budget is running just a little bit tight. Your emergency fund is your fund of last resort. It is there and you want it to be fully funded in case the unthinkable ever happens. If you dipped into it just for a gift or a one-time event, and you didn't have time to replenish it, and then an emergency actually happened, what would you do? Where would you go? Who would you turn to? And don't say debt, that can't be the answer. Now, I did mention that some people have multiple sinking funds. Other people just have one sinking fund and they put everything together. It all depends on how you want to approach it. Some people have a fund for the upcoming Christmas season, a vacation fund, another fund that has money in it for an upcoming show. Others simply take note of how much they will need in order to prepare for each of these upcoming events or items and make a grand total. There's really no right or wrong way to approach it, because remember, finance is personal. If you are incredibly organized and have a very strong attention to detail, maybe you describe yourself as type A, maybe you like the idea of having separate sinking funds, different buckets for different items. Or maybe you prefer the more consolidated approach where you have one fund for every need that you have. I have a single sinking fund that I put money into on a regular basis. Make no mistake about it though, I am still pretty darn type A. When I was in high school, my nickname was actually Monk, named after the character of the USA show. If you're not familiar with it, it's a great show, but if you are familiar, that's a little insight into my personality. I do want to say I'm a little less intense nowadays than I was when I was in high school, but it's still a fairly accurate descriptor. I use my sinking fund to pay for my taxes. They come up every single quarter. I recently used it to purchase a sauna. Sidebar, I am from the UP of Michigan, the Upper Peninsula, and yes, we pronounce it as a sauna, not a sauna. And it was my number one dream to buy a sauna when I bought my own home. So I did, and I'm so excited, and I absolutely love it, and I use it every single day. So if you don't have a sauna, I highly recommend it. And also, I recommend pronouncing it as sauna, not sauna. I also recently used the sinking fund to buy tickets to a Jerry Seinfeld show and Sebastian Maniscalco because I'm obsessed with comedians. I use my sinking fund on a regular basis. It helps to keep my finances on track. If I know I have bigger expenses coming up, I contribute more to these funds. If I have less expenses coming up, I contribute less. But it makes sure that I'm never touching my emergency fund and I'm never touching my investments. If you've never heard of a sinking fund before or you've never had one before, perhaps perhaps it's worth looking into. It can really help to remove some of the stress associated with finances, and it can really put the ball in your court. Once you know you have an expense coming up, you can start putting money away for it. And once that event or the item arises and that day is there that you have to pay for it, you already have the money earmarked for it. So it's ready to go. You don't have to wonder how you're going to pay for it, and you don't have to resort to debt. As far as how to start a sinking fund, sit down and look over your upcoming expenses, paying special attention to those expenses that don't pop up all that often. A vacation, an anniversary, a holiday, things like that. Figure out how long you have to prepare for it. Is it a couple weeks? It is a couple months. Once you know, mark how much you want to spend on that event. Then backtrack. How many weeks do you have to prepare? How many months? Create a line item in your budget, and every single week or every single month, have a designated amount go into that fund. So when that day arises, you have the money and you're ready to go. I really do like the idea of this fund or these funds being completely separate from your checking account, your savings account, and of course your emergency fund. Because these funds have a purpose all their own, they should have an account all their own. And being that these irregular expenses happen on a fairly regular basis, you want to make sure you put this money in an easily accessible area, like a high yield savings account or a money market account. You want to make sure when that expense arises, you have access to those funds, because it does you no good if it comes due and you can't access the money. So what do you think about sinking funds? Have you used them before? Will you use them in the future? Let me know in the comments down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you soon. Bye. You regularly your Roth IRA, just a good idea. Having savings, allow the funds amount sitting here. Like I said, I need you to stop. There's really, many people end up actually has to be paid this preparing for these events, but a sinking fund. Really, anything can go into a sinking fund to help you meet those. Most people, we'd all like to admit, I don't like it.